Okay, I think we're going to get started. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the CRMC and Rhode Island Sea Grant second webinar on Shoreline Access for All, Environmental Justice Along the Coast. I'm Laura Dwyer, CRMC's Public Educator and Information Coordinator. I'd like to thank our speakers tonight. We have Kate Mulvaney from US EPA, Julia Twichell of Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, and Leah Feldman of the CRMC. Before we get started with the speaking program, I'd like you to all take a few moments to complete our poll, which I'm going to launch right now. Hang on one second here. You should see it pop up on your screen any moment now. Okay, so while I'm talking to you, please just take some time and complete the poll. So just while you're doing that, a few housekeeping matters. We'd like to request that any questions you have during tonight's webinar be put into the Q&A section at any time, and our panel will answer the questions at the end of the presentations. We also received some questions from you all prior to the webinar. Thank you very much. And we'll be answering those as well during the Q&A. So now I'd like to introduce our new coastal policy analyst, Leah Feldman. Leah joined us back in December and specializes in public access issues. So she will be handling the CRMC's right-of-way efforts and public access. And we're delighted to have her speak tonight. So she's going to introduce our speakers in more depth. Thanks, Leah.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thanks everybody for being here. We really appreciate it. I am very grateful to be joined tonight by two leading women in the coastal access scene in Rhode Island. Our first speaker tonight is Kate Mulvaney, who is a social scientist for the Environmental Protection Agency. She focuses on integrating social and biophysical science for coastal and community protection, and is interested in environmental decision-making and the intersection between science and policy, focusing primarily on ocean and coastal issues, and the connection of local communities with environmental governance. She's going to start our program by introducing environmental justice in this context, and we'll discuss findings from a study investigating relative access to coastal public access points based on race, income, and geographical location in Rhode Island. Hi, Kate.
Hi, Kate. Thanks. Let me just launch launch your presentation and share my screen, okay?
Okay. I can introduce myself while the slides come up. I have that memorized. So I am a social scientist, as Leah said. I work for the EPA's research lab. We're based in Narragansett, Rhode Island, adjacent to the URI's oceanography campus. The work that I'm presenting today is on behalf of myself and some colleagues, Nate Merrill, who I think is on today, and Justin Bosquin, also out of the EPA, as well as Julia Twitchell, who's the next speaker. So these two talks go together pretty well. They're very complementary. We worked on them together. What this work does, it takes a look at one aspect of environmental justice in terms of thinking about coastal access and just looking across the landscape, across all of Rhode Island, and looking at how equitably we distribute access to the coast. Next slide, Laura. Today, I'll go through kind of a couple different topics, but I'll talk a little bit about coastal access and recreation. If you're joining a web series on coastal access, I think you probably already know quite a bit, probably more than I do. But we'll talk about the why and the how a little bit. I'll go into the geography of Rhode Island, so we're looking at this all through the same kind of lens or starting point, talk about the results of our research and some of the implications for that work. Next slide, please. Environmental justice is a term that's used a lot. There's a lot of different aspects to it and a lot of different facets. This work kind of focuses on one particular element, and that's distributional justice. And that's the concept that benefits and burdens of environmental resources are distributed fairly among all people. And that means everyone, regardless of who they are, regardless of gender, age, national origin, sexual orientation, their social class, their race, ethnicity, or more. A lot of the research that's been done so far is focused on disamenities, bad things, pollution, contaminated sites, where our environmental hazards affect. But when we're thinking about distribution of resources, it's also the good things. So parks and other types of green space, where we put our restoration projects and money for restoration of the environment. And then this is the animation next. And then also coastal excess, which is the topic of today. So kind of focusing on thinking about that as really an amenity of why we're the ocean state and why we want to be the coast and how equitably we do so in distribution. Next slide, Mara. When we think about coastal access, sometimes we use the term blue space. So coastal blue space benefits. There's a lot of reasons people want to go to the coast. We go for recreation, all sorts of different types of recreation. There's mental and physical health benefits of being on the coast, experiences in nature, either by ourselves or as social spaces with family and friends. A lot of people access the coast for different types of resources, for harvest, and then for any number of other reasons as well. Next slide. So what impacts access and recreation on the coast? There's a lot of different things that make the coast more or less accessible to different people, whether or not it's open to the public. The time, cost, and transportation. So the amount of time it would take you to get someplace is a limiting factor. How much it would cost to enter, an entrance fee, or how much it would cost you to drive there. Transportation, whether or not you own a car. Is it available on a bus line? If you rode a bike there, is there a safe place for you to lock it up? So there's a lot of different types of barriers that affect how accessible different sites are. And when we think about it, one of the metrics we can use is saying that those who live closer to a spot are more likely to go because it will cost them less, they won't have to spend as much time, and they would have more transportation options. They might be able to walk there as compared to drive, or they wouldn't have to drive as far, for example. Next bullet. Through the EPA lens, one of the things we think about a lot is water quality. And so some activities, if you're swimming, for example, you want a certain amount of water quality in order to not impact human health or your experience. But even things like boating can be affected if we have too much seaweed or other types of algae in the water. So when we think about it, we think about site quality for the water quality and kind of the area surrounding an access point. And then last bullet, the final piece is who you are. Is just looking at the characteristics of people. How equitable is our distribution? And that's the foundation of our research. So next slide. The foundation of our research question is, do different demographic groups have equitable opportunity to access and recreate on our coastline in Rhode Island? Next slide. When we're talking about Rhode Island, just to familiarize ourselves, I suspect there's a heavy Rhode Island audience today, but when we're looking at the map of Rhode Island, 74% of population on the census identify as non-Latinx white, so identify as white, but not Hispanic, Latino, or Latinx. And the darker blue on the map represents higher proportion of white non-Latinx. Next slide, please. You can push forward one. The highest proportion of people of color live in our most urbanized areas surrounding Providence. Both Black and Latinx populations, the highest proportion populations live surrounding Providence. Next slide, circle. The highest proportion of Asian populations are identified in kind of the suburban areas surrounding Providence. And then next bullet, and then the highest proportion of population that identify as Indigenous American are living near or on the Narragansett tribal lands. When we're talking about public access in Rhode Island, there's more than 400 spots, making us the ocean state. Julia's whole presentation is on this next, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but there's a lot of different types of recreational points. We're not just talking beaches. Our beaches are wonderful, but we have a lot of other ways that we use the water as well. And what we think about them through is that lens of water quality again. And when we're thinking about public access points, there's kind of like state level designations that we can look at in terms of whether or not there's impairments. And so the dots that you see on the map, the purplish dots have some water quality impairment. So 303D listings or other types of water body assessments, or they are closed or conditionally closed for shellfish harvest. So they just have some measure of water quality impairment. Those teal dots are places that don't have that history of impairment. And so those are most of our kind of southern facing or like southern part of the state has fewer impairments. Next slide. We can zoom in a little bit. Out of those 400, we have 30 state and town beaches, and they have a same divide in water quality. Within Narragansett Bay, they all have some history of some form of impairment over the last 5 years, as compared to those very southern facing beaches that have that don't have that history of impairment, almost all of which are in South County, Washington County, except for one that snuck over in Little Compton as well. Next slide, please. So focusing back on the research that we did, we looked to see if different demographic groups have equitable opportunities to access and recreate on the coast in Rhode Island. Next slide. To do so, we do something called equity mapping methods. And so we go down to the census block group level. That's taking towns and cities and breaking them up by population clusters. So groups of, so that there's kind of subgroups within a town or a city that are all roughly the same number of people. And so the actual like physical geographic size might be bigger or smaller, that has the same number, roughly the same number of people inside. We wanted to see if there were differences in the distance that those census block groups have to travel to get to different access points. Next bullet, yep. So we look at the distance to the nearest beach. And so just to get to any beach at all. And then we looked at the distance to the average distance to their 10 closest, public access points. And then we, in addition to looking at the beach and the 10 public access points, we looked at the cleanest, meaning those without any history of impairment. And that would be the average distance across 10 or to the cleanest beach. And next. What we want to do is see if there's differences, like what makes those distances change to get to beaches and coastal access points. So we looked at the characteristics of those census block groups, race and ethnicity, income, home value, unemployment, the percentage of seasonal housing in the census block group, vehicle ownership, how urbanized an area is, the density of the population, and what county they're in. Next slide, please. What we found is that we are the ocean state. On average, it's only 6 miles to the nearest 10 access points from any of the census block groups in the state. But that distance is less for census block groups that have a higher proportion of people who identify as white, non-Latinx white. And the average distance is farther if a census block group has a higher proportion population that is Black or Latinx. We also looked at both Asian and Indigenous American populations. We didn't find a statistical difference. That's possible. It's possibly because there's a relatively small proportion of the population overall that identify as either Indigenous American or Asian. And so we find these differences in how far people have to travel. Push forward one. The distance is even bigger when we look at the distance that people have to travel to get to waters that aren't impaired, what we call the cleanest points, right? No history. And again, it's the same. Populations with higher proportion of white population have to travel less far, and census block groups that have higher proportion of population that are Black or Latinx have to travel farther. Next slide, please. You can push forward one more. When we look at beaches, it's the same story. And so it's a little bit farther for anyone to get to the beach. It's an average of 10 miles to get to the beach from any census block group. And to get to the cleanest beach, the average distance is 31 miles. But it's a little bit closer for census block groups that have a higher proportion of population that are white. And it's farther for populations in census block groups that have a higher proportion that are Black or Latinx. Next slide. So what that tells us is there's some inequities statewide in terms of coastal access opportunity, and those are associated with race and ethnicity. If we were thinking about that through an equality lens, we would want everyone to be the same distance from coastal access points. So thinking about strategically where we would put public access points so that we can increase access and make it more equal. Next, if we go a step further and we think about that in terms of equitability, it would be that everyone would have a fair chance to get to a high quality shoreline given different resources. So thinking about transportation, parking, fees and permits to make it so that everyone can access the coast. Thinking about how we improve the environment at places with impairments now, how can we improve the environment for people to use or future access points as well. And then ultimately, can we think about restoring coastal sites so that we're enriching rather than excluding? Next slide is just a thank you slide. And there's my contact information if you have any questions. And Julia, who's the next speaker, also can answer a lot of questions too. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I'm just going to queue up Julia's presentation. Just bear with me, folks. Oh, wait, Julia's just going to share. Go ahead, Julia.
All right, well, thank you so much, Laura. Thank you, Kate. I have the honor next of introducing Julia Twichell, who is the watershed and GIS specialist for the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. She leads projects that advance visibility in science, collaboration, and watershed to coast efforts. Her work tackles the human dimensions and geographies of watershed and coastal problems with a focus on program strategy, map-based visual storytelling, and information design. She specializes in GIS and data analysis, strategic planning, interactive design, drawing on her background in social science and marine science. She is dedicated to advancing equity and delights in the intersection of science, art, and people. She will present research today that used anonymous cell phone data to track visits to coastal public access points around Narragansett Bay, and she will explore opportunities to improve coastal access based on the results of the study. Thank you, Julia.
Well, thank you so much, Leah. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. I'll click this out here. Cool. Can everyone see that? Great, got a nod. Well, thanks so much for the introduction. Yeah, I'm Julia Twichell, work at the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. So excited to present this as part of this webinar series. Thank you so much to CRMC for inviting us here this evening. So for this project that I'm going to present on tonight, it's really about bringing, exciting brand new science to support and better inform management policy around public access. And we acquired cell phone data for this project, and we were able to kind of take a detailed look at visits to the coast through our region's use of public access. And we think it's going to be really incredibly helpful for informing sort of how we better match our resources to actual use at these sites. And so I've created a story map that we're going to look at here. It's called How Do We Use Our Coasts? This was created in collaboration with researchers at the Environmental Protection Agency Narragansett Lab. Nate Merrill is an environmental economist. He acquired, verified, and kind of calibrated the data so that we could use it in this report. And then Kate Mulvaney, who also just presented, contributed her social science expertise as well to this project. So what I'm going to do is kind of scroll you guys through the highlights of the story map, but this is actually a public web resource, and we can share the link with all of you, and you can check it out in much more detail at your own leisure after this as well. All right, so we're going to dive in here. All right, so we looked at coastal public access across our region for the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, and so our region includes all of Narragansett Bay up into the Taunton River in Massachusetts, and then down to that south coast of Rhode Island, and a little bit of a sliver into Connecticut. And we included over 400 public access points to our shoreline, and we acquired cell phone data from a company called AirSage to document visitation to all of these points. And so with that, we asked a couple just key overarching questions. First, where do people go when they visit these points on the shore? And then also, where do they travel from? So this cell phone data that we acquired comes anonymously. We acquired it for the summer of 2019, so from June through September, summer months. And the way that it works is basically we delineate the boundaries of a site using satellite imagery. And then we basically get these counts of visits from the company AirSage based on phone pings that occurred within the boundaries of those site delineations. And they had to occur between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. for them to be counted. Those are kind of the prime daytime recreation windows. Now, what we get were very simple site counts. As researchers, we can't see any personal information or even individual devices. So the privacy on this data is great for us. And now, one of the things that we were curious about, though, is whether this data is good, whether it actually, tells us whether these visits are real. And so Nate Merrill at EPA worked on sort of validating the cell data by comparing observed counts that we had counted at a range of different coastal sites. And he published a paper on this, and I'm going to point out at the end sort of where that's linked if you want to dig in further. But basically, he found that cell data, captured this way are very good quality. Super consistent around a bunch of different kinds of sites, consistent across different sizes of sites in terms of like the number of visits from like tens of thousands of visits down to just 20 or so visits. But it does need to be calibrated, and that's because we found it consistently over-reports visitation. And so that calibration is actually represented throughout this report. And in total, what we found was about 2.5 million visits to all of those 400 plus coastal public access points for that summer of 2019. This estimate and all the estimates you're going to see throughout this report are kind of considered a conservative estimate. It represents a very high probability that those visits actually occurred, and we have good confidence in those numbers. So one of the most powerful aspects and exciting aspects, I think, of cell phone data is this ability to see where folks come from. And the way that we do that is third-party apps collect sort of voluntary location tracking to make your experience of like a weather app or a news app sort of more relevant to you. And so they collect sort of a home location that comes to us aggregated to the census plot group. And Kate did a great job of explaining what that is, but basically those are geographic groupings of neighborhoods. And again, we just get simple counts for those groupings of neighborhoods, no location history or anything further like that. So the privacy on that is very good. And basically what we can do is sort of tie up to these neighborhood geographies and create these really beautiful visitor origin maps. And so here we can see that during the summer of 2019, to all of those 400 public access points, we saw visits from all 50 states in the US, with really the majority coming from around New England, and really the vast majority coming from really close by to our coastline as well. And so I'm going to jump down to looking at beaches, but really the exciting thing we can do is actually look site by site at these visitor origin maps. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, you can click on the visitor origin map just for Narragansett Town Beach, for example. We saw about 70,000 visits to Narragansett Town Beach. You can see that this is a really Rhode Island centric visitor shed. Not too far away, we've got Scarborough Beach, with just about 18,000 visits clocking in. And that's a much more local visitor shed, a little bit more Providence centric. And then if we check out another large beach in Squamicut, we're seeing a much wider net being cast up into southern Massachusetts, over into Connecticut, which is pretty interesting. And just to give you a sense of some smaller beaches, we've got Connecticut and Oakland up towards the city a little bit more, and those are, again, much more local visitor origin maps. And so this information is super useful, I think. It really helps us visually understand how people are visiting these different sites. It helps us think about, what are the characteristics that draw people to a site? Is it the quality of the site? Is it parking availability? How close is it to where you live? Is it something about the water quality? And then from the management perspective, how can we augment services at these sites so that each site has a more beneficial impact to the community and can better accommodate use of that site? So there's a lot to explore here on your own time, a couple more beaches to look at, some sort of boat ramps and marinas, some scenic areas, fishing access, coastal walks. And I'm going to blow by this in the interest of time, and hopefully you guys will explore on your own. So the next question that we take on in the story map is sort of how are different kinds of sites visited? And so when we look at how different kinds of sites are used, like beaches or boat ramps or rights of way, we start to get a window into sort of how communities are using the coast and what our communities and tourists are valuing about the coastline. So we start out by looking at some of our beaches. These are all of our beaches in the sample. I certainly expected that beaches would sort of get the most visits by far. We're really famous for our beaches in Rhode Island. Definitely some of our bigger beaches like Misquamicut, like First and Second Beach, like Narragansett Town Beach. These are among the most sites visited individually in the entire data set. But 500,000 visits total is only about a fifth of all visits that we saw to the region. Remember earlier I showed you that 2.5 million number to the entire region. So there's really a vast use of other types of sites relative to beaches going on. So just a quick breeze through on that. To sort of docks and boat launches and marinas, sort of boating sites. We have about 1 million visits nearly. To our sort of scenic areas, parks and trails, we've got, again, about 500,000 visits. So this is on par with beaches, but you'll see there's actually a lot more of these sites. There's kind of a different type of use. There's sort of fewer visits per site. And then even down to our sort of tiny rights of way, these are, often just a dirt path to the shore, so not a big space to be in, but they really do sort of add up. And we see quite a bit of use over the course of the summer, about 150,000 visits are documented. So I think it's really interesting to kind of see this spread of use across different sites. It's really great information. It kind of shows how much people use our smaller sites, not just sort of the big parks and the beaches that we're famous for. And I think it's very informative for helping us to think about balance. How are we distributing our resources, for designated parking, for trash services, for monitoring? How are we distributing those resources in a way that matches the actual use of these different sites? I'm going to head to our next big section where we take a little bit of a different angle on sort of what attracts people to the coast. In this case, we're asking, does water quality or environmental condition matter to people? And so here we set up just a few maps. So this first map is a map of state recreational water quality assessment. This represents testing for bacteria and toxins. And so you can see, impacts in the Providence River and a few of these smaller embayments. Then overlay a map of shellfish harvest and consumption assessment. This is also based on pathogen testing and basically determines, whether you're allowed to dig clams and eat them safely. And again, it's these upper reaches of the bay that are more impacted, these smaller embayments. And this is really where, tidal flushing is lowest and we get, more influences from land. And then we overlay our regional visits. And this is what really struck me, 800,000 visits to the upper bay. That tallies to about a third of all visits across the entire region. So a lot of people are using these sites in spite of that crummier water quality in the upper bay, which I think is pretty interesting. I think what it tells us is that, water quality certainly isn't completely deterring visits to the coast up there, but I also think it makes clear that it's, continuing to focus on water quality improvements in the upper bay really does have the potential to benefit a lot of people who are using these areas. And we can create these sort of high quality public access points closer to home for a lot of folks and prevent that need to sort of travel as far to get to Great Coastline like we saw in Kate's presentation. So I'll take you to our last stop on this, which is a site viewer. Here you can sort of check out individual uses of different sites by the numbers. And each of these bubbles represent a site. You can click into a pop-up. So this is called State Park. You can get a little bit of a classification of the kinds of activities go on at that site if you're curious in the number of visits. And I think, I just want to sort of some take homes about this sort of map is really, it's the first time we can really actually see and visualize just how many people are using and enjoying public access. Cell phone data really makes that possible. Very exciting. And I think, it makes it really clear that this is a very important issue for our communities. A lot of people use public access, and I think it makes it clear that there's a need to sort of ensure that public access is safe and that's clean and able to sustain use, over the long term. And I think what this data can be particularly informative about, and I've made this point earlier, but I really want to drive this home, is that it's thinking about how we expend our uses, our resources. That's where this data can really come in handy going forward. How can we reflect this information that we're seeing here towards distributing our resources to support use of these smaller sites, to think about the services that are needed at different sites, included designated parking, trash services, information about site safety, things like that. So I just wanted to point out a last couple of things before I hand it back to the hosts here. First, for any of you data geeks out there, if you're interested in this information, all of these data sets are available through the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program GIS Data Hub. If you're not a GIS person, grab the Excel data set and you can just look at the spreadsheet. Everything's in there as well. And then if you are interested in actually visiting the coast, there are just some great coastal public access guides I want to point out and that are linked through this story map, one for Connecticut, one for Massachusetts, and one for Rhode Island. These are great and include a lot of information about what you need to know before you head out to these sites and how to select the right site for you for the right activities. And I just want to point out, for a further deep dive, we have a methods section. I just want to show you where the paper for the calibration process for Southland data is located, if you guys are interested in that deeper dive. All right, so thank you guys so much. I'm going to stop my screen share here and turn it back to the hosts.
Thanks, Julia, so much. And I think we're gonna have Leah give her presentation. So let me cue that up for you. Sorry, where is it? It's not coming up. Why is it on here?
Hey, Laura, I'm happy to share my screen if that's easier for you.
No, that's fine, Leah, because my computer, because I've got two screens, it's doing something funky right now. So
No problem at all.
Okay, thank you for rescuing me.
That's what I'm here for. All right, let me see if I can figure this out real quick. I'm gonna share my screen. Oops. All right, can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Excellent, awesome. Well, thank you so much to Julia and Kate for providing some really great background for the information that I am about to share. So my name is Leah Feldman. I am the Coastal Policy Analyst for the Coastal Resources Management Council. I'm going to share some research I did on coastal zone access and an experiential education program that took place at the Pell Elementary School Sale Newport program. So just to give you a little bit of an outline of what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to provide a little bit of background, not too much, thanks to Julia and Kate for really giving me an awesome jumping off point. I'm going to share with you the research questions I was interested in obtaining, the methods and results that I used to obtain those research questions, and then how all of that connects to the CRMC and our efforts there in public access. So just to give you a little bit of clue in as to why this, how this connects to CRMC. This was research I did for my master's thesis in 2019. on public access. And we've used a lot of this information to help inform our efforts at CRMC. So as many of you know, and we just heard, the coastal zone is a fragile place. Protection of these coastal resources is really necessary. The coastal zone is limited. There are coast-dependent uses that we have to take into consideration, like energy production and shipping, as well as coast-enhanced uses like residential and commercial development. And finally, space for public recreation is in the mix, and it really all has to be balanced. And the fact that this coastal zone area is limited means that there is tension between these uses. It's a really demanded upon area with competing interests, and of course, privatization of coastal land limits public accessibility. So why is public accessibility to the coast so important? Why do we have to protect it? In this presentation, I hope to highlight why protecting shoreline access is so important, what the Coastal Resources Management Council is doing about protecting access rights, and how environmental justice affects the ability to freely and openly access constitutionally protected rights to the shoreline in Rhode Island. Oh, let me move this out of the way. I don't know if you guys are seeing that. Okay. All right, so the Rhode Island Constitution guarantees citizens the rights to swim in the sea, gather seaweed, or fish from the shore. Nevertheless, getting access to the shore can be difficult, particularly in urban areas with environmental justice concerns. Additionally, preserving and creating lateral access along the shore gets more difficult as sea levels rise, erosion continues, and in response to those things, hardening of the shoreline proliferates. The Coastal Resources Management Council is dedicated to not only expanding and improving our public access to the shore work, but also to work with partners to establish coastal buffers rather than armoring the shoreline, which can provide a lot of co-benefits such as public access, as well as habitat improvement, stabilization of the shore, and filtering runoff into the water. Additionally, environmental justice continues to inform most of our efforts on this at the CRMC. Currently, there are only 3 of the Coastal Resource Management Council's 226 designated rights of way to the shore in Providence, despite the fact that Providence is one of the most densely populated areas in the state near the shore. And all 3 of those rights of ways are on the east side along the Seekonk River. However, just yesterday, Tuesday evening, the Coastal Resources Management Council's Public Access Subcommittee met to designate a brand new right of way on Public Street in South Providence within an environmental justice community. So bringing us back a little bit further, in 1972, the Coastal Zone Management Act was established, and it created a national policy and program for the management, beneficial use, and protection and development of the coastal zone. And there was a focus here on addressing that competition between public and private use of the shoreline. That being said, it was limited in a lot of ways. It failed to anticipate the enormous challenges presented by growing populations, limited resources. This act really prevented the coast from being dominated by industry, but really didn't do too much to protect the coast from being controlled by private interests, specifically of a singular populace. Segregation era practices still rule a lot of the coastal landscape. There are discriminatory and preventative measures on the coast like parking bans, illegal fencing, widespread private beach associations, and coastal land that is being controlled by a wealthy elite. These images here are from the 1970s. They were from a book called Free the Beaches by Andrew Carl, which was the story of a man named Ned Cole, who brought inner city Black youth to the private beaches of Connecticut in order to protest privatization and segregation of coastal land that really rightfully belonged to the public. Which brings us to another nearby coastal town in the Northeast, similarly controlled. Of course, talking about Newport, Rhode Island. This is a coastal town in Rhode Island known for prestigious sailing, world-class beaches, and a vibrant tourism industry. For about 50 years, this was home to the America's Cup, which is the world's foremost sailing competition. So it brought international spectators and sailors all to Newport. Today's Newport is a racially, ethnically, and financially diverse place, with the median income reported as being significantly lower than the rest of Rhode Island, with a really enormous disparity in wage distributions. The third statistic down, you can see on your screen, the Gini percentage, G-I-N-I. This is a statistic that reflects representation of equality of wage distribution. So 0 is a perfectly equal wage distribution and 1 is perfectly unequal. The average Gini score in Rhode Island is 0.42, I'm sorry, the average score in the United States is 0.423, and in Rhode Island, the score is 0.5, so higher than the average for the rest of the country. And additionally, 14% of Newport's population lives below the poverty line. Which brings us to my study group. Pell Elementary School is part of the Newport public system. It is located in the 5th ward of Newport. 68% of the Pell Elementary School students are eligible for subsidized lunch, which is higher than the 48% statewide average. 33% of the students identify as Hispanic or Latino, as compared with 23% of the statewide average, and 28.9% identified as Black or African American. And importantly, 25% of students from the school live in families living below the federal poverty line, and 65% of students enrolled in the whole Newport public system, not just Pell Elementary School, are considered low income, as opposed to 39% statewide. So in 2017, Sail Newport and the Pell Elementary School Sailing Program partnered, which allowed Pell Elementary School 4th grade students to learn to sail as part of their regular school day. This was a really innovative 16-week program providing hands-on experiential learning on and off the water. It exposed students to life in the waters of Narragansett Bay and taught, in addition to sailing, sustainability concepts, marine science, and weather and ocean conservation ideas. So I had 3 main research questions during this program. One being what impact this program had on the students' knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors regarding Narragansett Bay and various environmental features. What feelings of connectedness to nature and the coastline arose in relation to this program? And finally, what are the potential connections between knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors regarding coastal recreational practices and beliefs? So I gave surveys to students. These were self-administered structured surveys given to 4 classrooms. My control group was the 3rd grade Pell Elementary School students who were non-participants, who had not yet participated in the Pell Elementary School program. And of course, my participants were the 4th grade students. The surveys were given in English and Spanish and were read out loud twice to participants. Whoops, skipped one there, there we go. So, the survey questions were designed according to, reading comprehension skills, methodologies specifically for elementary school age children, based off of lots of research on how to best attain this information. I also conducted some informal participant observation. I observed 2 of the 4th grade classrooms twice a week on both the sailing and the on-land portion of the program. Engaged in a lot of informal conversations that brought to light a lot of my research. Students were really excited about sailing. They were excited and a little nervous about being on a boat. They looked forward to the outdoor engagement and really eagerly shared a lot of their knowledge and experiences about things they did outside of the classroom, like when they went to the beach with their families, boating trips they'd taken outside of school, things like that. So the statistics here that showed sort of correlated some of the things I observed during my participant observation. Here are some of the knowledge statistics. You can see that the participants versus the non-participants really improved on being able to correctly identify Sail Newport, like where it was on a map. So some geographical information. We're able to identify animals living in Newport Harbor, and we're better able to identify which boat, a sailboat versus a motorboat, creates less pollution. There are 3 statistics here I want to share, which I called belonging, stewardship, and future boater. All three of these statistics show that those who participated in the Pell Elementary School sailing program, those who have experienced increased coastal access show an increased sense of belonging to the coast, an increased sense of pro-environmental behavior, and an increased desire to continue being on the water in their future or potentially working with boats in their future. This is some deep statistics for those who are interested. Basically what this boils down to is that students who said that they wanted to be future boaters were more likely to feel like they belong at the coast and were more likely to be participants than non-participants. So, the short-term results of this study were pretty obvious. Students learned to love the sport of sailing, which is something that not many of them had the opportunity to do without the program. There was a willingness for students of this particular demographic to return to the coast, to feel a sense of belonging, and creating, potentially to create a more equitable and diverse coast. This program really highlighted the importance of bringing people to the water, and particularly people who otherwise might not have the opportunity to recreate at the water, which, importantly is something that really can't be done without adequate, available, and protected access points to the coast. Which brings us back to the Coastal Resources Management Council. We at the Coastal Resources Management Council published a brochure alongside Rhode Island Sea Grant on how to access the coast. And in 2016, CRMC and Rhode Island Sea Grant launched Shoreline Rhode Island, which is a user-friendly app that allows residents to explore Rhode Island's access points and specifically the CRMC designated rights of way. The app allows users to search for access point in the state based on specific activities and specific location, and provides other important accessibility information like parking and trash receptacles, and whether there are American Disability Association compliant handicap accessibility features, and some tied information as well. We at the CRMC are really, really focused and passionate about increasing and enhancing these rights of way. We have a goal of achieving 1 right of way for every mile of shoreline in Rhode Island, which equals over 400 accessible rights of way. We're working with state partners and local partners to ensure equitable access, including Save the Bay, Clean Ocean Access, the Nature Conservancy, Rhode Island DEM, DOT, and EPA. Whoops, that's it. So this is just a little snapshot of some of the rights of ways in Rhode Island. As I mentioned before, currently only 3 of Rhode Island's rights of way to the shore are in Providence, despite the fact that it's really densely populated, and it's one of the most densely populated areas in the state near the shore. And again, as I mentioned earlier, yesterday, the CRMC Public Access Subcommittee met to designate a new right of way on Public Street in Lower South Providence, establishing a new access route to the shore in a majority low-income, majority Hispanic population. So, the Pell Elementary School program showed how enjoying coastal activities can lead to increased instances of access in the future. The more kids liked and identified with a coastal activity, the more likely they were to access the coast in the future. Well, obviously not every child in Newport or any urban coastal center gets to participate in a program like this. Increased coastal public access points, particularly those cited in places where children and adults have historically not had open and available access to the coast, can increase the frequency with which children, adolescents, adults visit the shoreline, potentially increasing feelings of belonging to the shore and impacting those pro-environmental behaviors. So how can you help? Once a coastal access point has been designated by the CRMC as a public right-of-way, the public's right to pass over that site to access tidal waters of the state is protected forever. The CRMC prohibits any activities that would obstruct the public's use and pursues legal action against individuals that block or impede public access at the designated rights of way. But before reaching the CRMC's designation process, we have to do, or a detailed review has to be done of town records and historical documents so that the right of way can be properly documented. cities and towns can assist in this designation process by identifying potential public rights of ways, conducting some of their own background research, and gathering evidence, which the CRMC legal staff can then verify and then use during the hearing process. We've got a very user-friendly handbook that helps to provide guidance to anyone who is interested to participate in the right-of-way designation process. Additionally, you can help in announcing, maintaining, and using these rights of ways by becoming adopt a right-of-way sponsor. By adopting a CRMC right-of-way, sponsors can ensure that that particular right-of-way is maintained and protected as a scenic access point to be utilized and enjoyed by the public. It becomes further protected from development and really is a great way to assist in this process. If you or anybody you know, your neighborhood, your group, or a group association would like to partner with the CRMC to sponsor a right-of-way, please contact me or my associate Kevin Cute at CRMC. My email address is on the next slide. And with that, I will finish up and say thank you very much for giving me this time. And I will stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks so much, Leah. Okay, so now we're going to turn it over to our Q&A session, and Monica Allard-Cox of Rhode Island Sea Grant and Emily Bedell, our graduate student fellow from Duke University, will both be moderating your questions. Just a reminder, please enter any questions you have for our speakers into the Q&A function, not the chat. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you again to all the presenters. I just wanted to let folks know we got a number of questions, both in the Q&A and also submitted ahead of time. So we have a half hour, so hopefully we can get through most of them. We are going to prioritize the ones that specifically pertain to environmental and social justice. For some of the others, if we have a time to get to them, we certainly will. But I wanted to let everyone know that CRMC's website has a whole section on public access. So, and we are adding the previous webinar recordings, summary notes from the previous webinar, and we'll be doing the same with this one as well. And there will be additional information that will answer some of your questions if we don't get to those tonight, particularly the ones that are more general about public access generally. So the first question I have goes to each of the presenters. And so I think I'll just ask in order of the way of your presentations. So the first question is, what are the next steps with regards to this environmental justice work? So start with Kate. How do you see anything further, or what are your next steps at EPA?
So some of our from our research, like we're kind of from the research side of this. And so the first part of this was just looking to see where the disparities are and where differences are. And we can what we'd like to be able to do is overlay that more for us, because we think a lot about environmental quality at the different sites. And so being able to look, as we see the disparities and we see some differences, would be to focus on particular areas where maybe the disparities are even more significant, or there's more types of pollutants or contaminants of concern. So that's some of our work. Is there's one thing is to look across the whole state, but then it's a lot of times when we're thinking about coastal access and kind of justice, it's also understanding at a localized scale, what are the things that are really keeping people from being able to use a site. And so understanding more about some of the locations as well.
I can jump in next from the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program. A couple different things. First of all, I'm the GIS person there, so I've been putting out a couple of these products that are more research oriented or more dedicated to getting research to public or other sort of mainstream audiences. There is another story map that I launched recently about environmental justice in the Narragansett Bay watershed, which covers a range of issues beyond coastal access, with water quality, land use, or things like that. So definitely check that out at our website. And then I should also mention we're kicking off, we're fully into our 10-year planning that we do as one of the national estuary programs. This is a plan called Vision 2032 that we're doing. It's a multi-stakeholder plan. We have tons of people involved. We want to get as many people from the public and all corners of the watershed involved, and we're working on sort of getting that out more broadly. So it's great to be able to talk about this here a little bit. So this is sort of 10-year planning where we're going to be carving out space for sort of action planning around water quality, around wildlife and habitat, and then also specifically around sort of quality of life, like community-oriented projects that would include things like public access, and then also sort of our partnerships capacity to take action. So things that will help us sort of do the work and make sure that it gets done, funding, other things like that. So we're currently in the planning process, and we definitely invite anyone who's interested to come to our meetings. You can just learn more about this process at vision2032.org. There's also a public survey available through that website, and we'd love anyone here to take that survey and pass it around. And certainly there's some questions about public access and some open-ended pieces, and we're just trying to collect as much input as possible to inform the planning.
Thanks, Julia. Would you be able to put that link in the chat so people can find that? Thank you. And Leah.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, I mean, I think from the CRMC's perspective, it's really important for us to continue working on developing and maintaining our partnerships with local organizations that sort of have a boots on the ground feeling for what comes next, like, the EPA and Narragansett Bay Estuary Reserve. We are actively seeking out new partnerships as well to help us identify rights of ways that can be designated by the CRMC, and really helping to continue to improve the quality of those rights of ways. So there's a variety of ways that we are focused on doing that. But I think it starts with really just getting the information we need from our partners.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes right from the Q&A. And it is, would Rhode Island consider establishing an express public transit bus to beaches from major urban hubs with enough frequency to make it useful? So 20 minutes for a bus to arrive should be the maximum time to wait. Could this come from parking fees?
I can jump in on that one. There are a couple such projects and methods of transportation available. There's a beach bus currently from Newport that runs, I can't say it's every 20 minutes, but it's fairly frequent. And I think Rhode Island DOT is one of the partners I was talking about in my last answer. We are working with them to try to facilitate continued public transportation to the shore. It is something that in the era of COVID was interesting to address. Obviously, having public access even in times of this, if not more important than it was before, but doing so safely and responsibly was really important. So it's definitely something we're picking right back up and trying to reinvigorate, but definitely something to keep your eye on for the future. We're working on it.
Thanks, Leah. The next question is for Julia. Someone was asking, what biases are introduced by using cell phone data? Are you confident that this is representative of the entire population of patrons to the beach?
Great question. So cell phone data is a sample of the total population. So some of the details I skated over that are hidden in the methods section are the cell phone data that we receive is collected from a sampling of third-party apps. It doesn't represent like every single ping that your phone makes. And that sample is scaled up by AirSage. And then also your phone doesn't necessarily ping continuously. That kind of depends on how you use your phone. If you're like constantly on your apps, then maybe it does, but for most people, that's spread out. So there is sort of interpolation between those pings to kind of figure out whether someone occurred, in one of the site boundaries that we submitted. So again, there's some scaling there that happens. those methods are proprietary and we don't have access to them. And that's why NEAT did that full calibration and why we wanted to validate that the cell phone data actually represents coastal use. A lot of times cell phone data is used for other applications like transportation and things like that. So we wanted to know if that represented coastal use as well. And so we actually went out and did like head counts at these different coastal sites, and also pulled in counts from some of the bigger beaches where they actually do, track people coming onto beaches, and did sort of the calibration that way. And so, like I said, that number that you're seeing there is a conservative scaling, sort of to represent the total population. And I think it's conservative, meaning that it's probably a little bit on the lower side, and you can be confident that those are real numbers and real visits.
Great, thank you. Our next question is also for Julia. Does the cell phone survey data include people fishing and clamming, and can those numbers be sorted out?
Also interesting. It would include them because they represent part of the people who are using the site, but we can't tell what people are doing by the cell phone numbers. There is in that data set that's available some classifications based on the type of site. So there are some like sites that are designated as fishing or shell fishing, things like that. So you can start to get a sense of, if some of those how those fishing or shell fishing sites are being used. That being said, most sites have multiple uses, so you can't really isolate that super easily, but we'd certainly be interested in that too.
I can add to that a little bit. We've been trying to think about that too, because it really kind of the use of the water and what people are doing at a site would be how at risk they are. So like if we don't want people maybe shell fishing at places with contaminated sites or something like that. So, for us to try to think about how people are using the coast at a broader scale, there's some people that are developing methods like how long somebody stays there might be representative of their type of activity and things like that. But that's just, that's like a kind of research of the future rather than what we know about now.
Thank you. Julia, and this is just a quick question following up on your work. Folks were interested in whether or not your work was funded by a grant, and if you had an idea of the costs of doing it.
So Kate might also be able to weigh in on this, but so EPA purchased the cell data, and I believe at the time it was somewhere around the ballpark of like 20 per site per month or something like that, $20 per site per month, something like that. And that's changing. I think it's cheaper over time. And then Narragansett Bay Estuary Program, we did the work on the report and the analysis for our region.
Yeah, and we bought the data as a part of a bigger package. So it's hard to, we've bought data at a couple of different times, and it's not the same cost every time we buy it. So it's like it feels a little false for us to be like, this is how much it costs when it has changed every time we've bought it. But we bought it through just kind of our pipeline funding for research in our lab.
Great, thank you. We have another question about the data collection, I believe for Julia, but Kate, you can probably also comment as well. I'm curious to learn more about the data for each of the access points. The attribute table appears to have a few fields, swim, fish, etc. Is there a plan to collect more data?
Oh, that's a good question. So that access data set you're seeing is derived from the publicly available state data sets, and those have a lot more information in any of those and are available for download at RIGIS, MassGIS, and Connecticut DEEP, where we got those. So those were some sort of classifications across the different state attributes that were available to try to mesh those together in a simple way. And a lot of those attributes are, I think accessible through those 3 coastal visitation apps, like the Shoreline Rhode Island. You can get some of that parking and site type information through there as well. So that data kind of drives some of those apps as well.
Thank you. And sorry, my unmute button is working really slowly tonight. I apologize for that. Emily, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good. So we have one other question from the Q&A. Can CRMC provide a point of contact from the subcommittee or legal team to the public as a line of communication for providing documentation, answering questions, or addressing concerns regarding public access and right-of-ways?
Thanks. Yeah, I would say the easiest way to get that information over to our legal team and to the folks that really collect that is through me or my partner Kevin Cute, who is a marine resource specialist at the CRMC, who's been doing right-of-way work for a very long time. I'm still pretty new to the scene in comparison. And then also, of course, our director, Jeff Willis, is very willing to take on information that might be helpful to us for designating new rights of ways and making sure that they get the legal backing that they need.
And we just had a couple of questions about folks who are interested in how and what CRMC is doing in terms of trying to help ensure that the rights of way are maintained and stay clean and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like a bit of a broken record. I just keep talking about how important our partnerships are, but it really is just like the bread and butter of how we do this stuff successfully at the CRMC. So in terms of cleanup and making sure that the access points remain maintained, it's a partnership with towns and municipalities and their departments of public works, their DPWs. And then, it's also important to remember that this is something that we can access really only through like specific CRMC designated rights of ways. There are a number of rights of ways that exist within the state and are used quite frequently that are not CRMC designated yet. We'd like them to be. So the ones that do have a CRMC designation, we are able to better partner with the towns and municipalities to maintain the quality. So another push for getting in that research and helping us designate more rights of way.
Great. Sort of going off of that, has CRMC considered designating Rhode Island state-operated parks, facilities, conservation areas, et cetera, as official CRMC right-of-ways? In some municipalities, this is a significant portion of the waterfront. Similarly, how does the CRMC work with federal agencies to encourage more right-of-way access on their properties?
Sorry, my mute button was also taking a little bit of time. It's a really interesting question. It's a good question. It is something that I think we haven't worked with state agencies in the past to establish rights of ways, but it's something that we could certainly talk about and think about. State properties can be sold. And so in that sort of transfer of rights, we might experience some just unanticipated difficulties that we have not yet thought about, but it's something that we are certainly considering. State parks tend to do their own maintenance, their own sort of like access that we, we'd love to work with them on, but they sort of have an established infrastructure that we're, considering working with, but, theoretically, state parks and federal parks could, tomorrow change hands. So it'd be, it's really important to us when we designate a right of way that it is designated in perpetuity. So it's something we have to think about a little bit more closely. That being said, they are excellent access points in and of themselves. While I don't think it would be necessarily redundant to also designate them as a CRMC right of way, there is really great programming and availability of access at those state and federal locations. So encourage folks to use those as well.
Thank you. And for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize. We got several questions, which I do think are very relevant to equity in terms of signage and how people can know whether they are at a right of way, are they in the right place? So both signage and then what's available on the CRMC website in terms of like GIS maps that indicate the rights of way. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I discussed two separate tools that the public can use in my presentation, the first of which was the Public Access Guide that was published in 2004 by CRMC and Rhode Island Sea Grant. This guide is, we talk a lot about in the CRMC about the difference between regulations and guidance. And this is a guide, it is guidance. It is a collection of rights of way, some of which have been designated by the CRMC as a right of way, some have not. There are a large number of state and federal parks and places that are in that list. So it's a really great way to find an access point that is near to you and convenient and suits the needs at hand. That being said, it is not a regulatory document. So there is no regulation or statutes from that document that can be enforced. That is the case, that is true. That being said, just last week, we had somebody contact the CRMC asking about a public access point that was in that guide that they had interpreted as a CRMC designated public access point. We pointed out to the gentleman that it was not in fact a CRMC access point. And then, as soon as we got off the phone with the man who had tried to access the beach, we right away called the recreation department just to, absolutely make sure that we were correct in how we had designated that access point, and to be sure that, the laws and regulations on accessing the point at that park were in place. And it turned out to be a private beach, a private location, not a public access point. So it's a work in progress. And the second tool that I highlighted was the Shoreline, Rhode Island website. Similarly, that includes some non-CRMC designated rights of ways. However, it does have the ability to toggle. So you can choose to find only CRMC access points using that tool. Or similarly, you can decide to look for a use-based access point or a parking-based access point, or whatever navigation works best for you with that tool.
Thanks, Leah. So our next question is, it was really interesting to see the proportion of non-beach visits. Are there policies, management options, or funding priorities that can help increase equitable access for those sites, especially the ones with the best water quality or other amenities?
I guess I can jump in a little bit on this, but I'm curious to see what folks are thinking about too. Yeah, I mean, I think I definitely feel like I was super struck by how many people were up in the Upper Bay areas, how heavy those visits were. I feel like potentially, you can't make the full assumption, but if we were to improve water quality, presumably some of those visits would go up. Visits were coming from kind of all over local areas, but also from further away. I think they're getting some sort of tourist use as well. So I think from perspective of, thinking about not just water quality cleanup, but also sort of site improvement aspects around, the parking, around litter, around other kind of site safety sort of aspects, just making those places, more community feeling, more, just friendly to be. I think that's, a super important piece to think about. I think that's something that a lot of local smaller groups are kind of working on and trying to coordinate those efforts. I think it's going to be super important. And sort of, again, that sort of partnership piece that we've been bringing up. How do we kind of use data-driven methods to then coordinate work that's going on really locally and make sure that some of those little just sort of site improvement pieces can happen.
Yeah, I mean, those small local spots are a nice way to also see kind of victories, right? So Connecticut opened this year for shellfishing for the first time in a long time, right? And so it's a spot that, is in a more urbanized area, has a higher proportion of people of color living nearby. And so we're, as we improve water quality in the Upper Bay, we're improving it for people who have had more limited relative access to the water. And so I think that some of those feel like real success stories. I mean, the complement along with that is, trying to make sure that we're getting information to keep people safe about kind of there's a long legacy in recreational fishing and shellfishing of, more harmful consumption patterns by people of color. That there's a more like a higher likelihood of people consuming more fish, right? And so there's often like regulations about how many fish people should consume during a month or something like that for mercury or other things. And trying to ensure that we're really getting information out there in languages that people understand or are using other methods to communicate if populations aren't comfortable in English or other languages of just making sure that people know as we open areas up that there are maybe still limitations in consumption and things to keep them safe.
Thank you. We have a question about other dimensions of environmental justice. So besides distribution justice, are there other dimensions of environmental justice we should think about in the realm of coastal resources? And I would direct that at any of you.
I think to add to that, I think, we think about who's being impacted, whether it's by pollution or those disamenities that Kate mentioned. Then we think about access to resources. Then I think there's also sort of access to information and access to processes and decision making, which is super important to think about. I think that's like a whole other dimension about how we make people who work for these organizations more inclusive. How do we bring people into the planning? How do we hear from kind of knowledge systems that exist that we're not used to sort of working with in science? I think that's something that we have a lot of learning to do in our region, definitely across the US too. But I think there's a lot of momentum around it too, which is very hopeful. But yeah, challenging to think about how you get people involved, and I think also valuing their time and knowledge, paying people to participate, things like that.
Julia covered, I mean, a lot of the things that I would say too. And from a more researchy lens, we did a whole review to try to find out different types of environmental justice research that people have done on water and coastal water, and there's not that much. And so it's that we're at a very starting point of thinking about environmental justice through a coastal lens. A lot of our waterfront properties are expensive, right? And so there's been a lot of things that make it so we haven't maybe thought about environmental justice right at the waterfront always, but we have in some ways, right? We think about it through ports. There's some environmental justice work in ports, including the Port of Providence. There's other types of projects, but there's just a long ways to go in terms of almost anything in terms of relative access. And it's through the access to the participating in access to the coast, but also in who decides where they get access and And so forums like this or ways to have people's voices be heard, and reaching out into communities and engaging with people who haven't been engaged with historically. And it's hard, how do you engage people who haven't been historically engaged? It's hard, and so it's a lot of ways of thinking differently, I think, and working hard for it.
Yeah, I think Julia and Kate just did a wonderful job, addressing the various aspects and perspectives in that question. I think we're working really hard to meet people where they're at and ask the right questions. I think that's pretty much it. We're trying to be informed by the communities that are being affected. So we're doing everything we can to address that.
Great. Our next question is there a goal of enhancing the quality of access points? So for example, including waste bins, restrooms, improving water quality, adding signage, or installing kayak or boat ramps?
Yes. I think it's a huge goal. One of our main concerns at the CRMC is trying to make sure that these access points are not only being increased in quantity, but also quality. So we want to make sure that people who are using the coasts are using the coast safely, using the coast responsibly in the ways that best serves them. Making sure that we are building those partnerships I keep coming back to with towns and municipalities to ensure that the right infrastructure is there to allow for those kinds of improvements. But it is high on our priority list. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. To pipe in again about the Vision 2032 planning, I'm definitely, trying to carve out space for projects like that, and that will, open up, the funding that comes behind Vision 2032 to be sort of shunted towards those kinds of projects. And I think that's something that we want to hear from people about where that work needs to happen and make sure that we get that into the plan.
Thank you. We have a question about looking at some of the conflicts between private property owners, abutters, and then this trying to designate more rights of way. And I don't, might be a tough question to answer. I'll just say that up front. But how do policymakers achieve a balance between preserving public access to the shoreline and property owners who are concerned about that public access to the, adjacent to their property? Are there good prospects for an inclusive, non-litigious process?
I can start off on that one. Lateral access is something that we take very seriously. It's something that we're always thinking about. We understand property rights, we understand safety and privacy and all of the things that come with, that bundle of sticks when you purchase a property. And additionally, we understand what the constitutional protected rights to the shore for the public are. And it's a delicate balance trying to make sure both bundles of sticks, both rights, both sets of rights are maintained. It's not an easy thing because I think that there are a lot of conflicting interests that are there. As I included in part of my slide, in the Rhode Island Constitution laid out very clearly, there are certain rights to the shore that are indelible, they can't be argued. That being said, the last thing we want to encourage is sort of irresponsible use and impairments to private enjoyment. So we are continuing to really do the groundwork to facilitate that being approached in the most responsible way. And no, I don't think it always ends up in a litigious response. I think that it's something that can be discussed and something that can be mediated. And I think it has been really successfully in the past. There are instances of this working out really, really well for everyone involved. So I think we are really just trying to replicate that in the future and continuing to, approach it with everybody's interests in mind.
And just a quick follow-up to that, someone also, or a couple of people have asked about lateral access, as you had mentioned, and with sea level rise encroaching on that. And this question was also for all of the panelists. Are you looking at that as an issue, and do you have any thoughts on what could be done to address that sort of loss as lateral access butts up more and more against private property with sea level rise and erosion?
Tough one. I think sea level rise is probably a bee in a lot of people's bonnets. But I mean, I know there's there's talk about salt marsh migration, or trying to buy up, or I don't know what the word is, transition some of that coastal land to allow some of that buffering. And maybe that's where also we could do multi-use kind of public access projects, things like that. Could be one way to try to think about that. Difficult one though.
Yeah, I would say that I hadn't thought about it. It's a great question. And when we, like other work that we do, we look at sea level rise, and it would flood a lot of the existing, like when we're looking over the next 50 years or 100 years, the projections for Rhode Island is that a lot of those sites would be flooded. So like thinking about the overlay of those two, just like spatial data sets, the CRMC will be thinking about that. But there are some, there is definitely, it's a lot to think about, and it would be just another aspect of justice. One of the aspects people talk about is generational justice, right? It's not just thinking about you or your own kids, but thinking about future generations, and that's where the sea level rise component would really fit into it, I think.
Shoot, I was muted. Okay. I think that's a really great point. The idea of generational justice being something that we think about as we, work to create these public access points and work to maintain the current points that are there that may not be there, sometime in the future. It's also, I think, something that is being looked at from a couple different directions. There's current legislation that's sort of analyzing ways to decriminalize lateral access trespasses, sort of, I think, partially as a result of this question, because what's used typically in Rhode Island to decide where the public is allowed is a mean high water mark, and of course, as sea levels rise, that is changing. And so the idea of criminalization of lateral access is something that's under scrutiny, because that line is getting harder and harder to delineate as things change. So it's part of how this is being looked at in terms of like a longitudinal view, as opposed to just something for the current view. So definitely something that's at the top of mind.
Thank you. So that wraps up our question and answer time period. So thanks to all of our panelists for fielding all those questions so thoughtfully. And with that, I'll turn it back to Laura.
Sorry, everyone. Technical difficulties and a mouse that wouldn't move. Okay. Just wanted to thank all of our speakers tonight and my colleagues, Monica and Emily, for their help. Again, we are going to be posting the recording of this webinar within the next day or so on our YouTube channel, which you can access by going to our homepage and clicking on the YouTube icon, or all of the materials, associated links, resources will be living on our public access page under topics, also from the homepage. So with that, I just want to thank everyone again for attending, and please reach out to any of us if you have follow-up questions after the event, and hope to see maybe a few of you for the third one, which is to be announced. So thank you all. Have a great night.